Guy Burgess was drunk at parties where he passed secrets. Donald Maclean had a breakdown British security attributed to overwork. Anthony Blunt was knighted before his exposure. Kim Philby held a press conference denying he was a Soviet agent and was believed, then worked for British intelligence 8 more years. The Cambridge Five's greatest protection was one thing: the British establishment could not believe men of their class could be traitors. That assumption cost the West 30 years of secrets. The Cambridge Five were recruited not through blackmail or money, but through ideology. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression had discredited capitalism across Western Europe. Fascism was rising in Germany. The Soviet Union, whatever its actual conditions, appeared to offer an alternative that attracted idealistic young men from elite backgrounds who believed the existing order was producing catastrophe. Their recruiter, Arnold Deutsch, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under academic cover in London, identified Cambridge as the ideal environment. The most talented young men in Britain, destined for its most powerful institutions, radicalized at precisely the moment they could be reached. He was correct in every assessment. Kim Philby was the most damaging. Recruited by Deutsch in 1934, he joined MI6 in 1940 and rose to head its anti-Soviet Section 9, the section responsible for running operations against Soviet intelligence, from 1944 to 1946. He later became MI6's liaison officer to the CIA in Washington, giving Soviet intelligence direct access to joint Anglo-American operations. He was the third most senior officer in MI6. Every counterintelligence operation he knew about, Soviet intelligence knew about. Every CIA officer he met, the KGB assessed. He continued active intelligence work for the Soviets while drawing his MI6 salary. The penetration was total. Donald Maclean was the Foreign Office's head of American affairs, giving the Soviet Union access to the most sensitive Anglo and American diplomatic communications during a critical Cold War period, including Korea and the early nuclear weapons program. Guy Burgess served in the Foreign Office, and Mimi providing intelligence on British personnel files and operational planning. Anthony Blunt served in ME during WED, providing Soviet intelligence with the names of British agents across Europe. John Cairncross worked at GCHQ and passed enigmas and decrypted intelligence to Moscow, including German military operational plans that may have contributed to the Soviet victory at Kursk. 5 men, 5 different institutional positions, one complete picture of the West's most sensitive operations. The specific damage the Cambridge Five caused is difficult to fully calculate because the penetration was so long and so complete that auditing it requires knowing everything they had access to. And their access was extensive enough that the audit is never quite finished. What is documented: Cairncross passed the Soviets' German military Enigma decrypts, including Luftwaffe operational plans before Kursk in 1943. Maclean passed atomic program intelligence, including the first American estimates of Soviet nuclear capability. Philby compromised the 1949 Anglo-American operation to infiltrate anti-communist agents into Albania, an operation in which every agent was captured or killed upon landing. The Albanian operation's failure was total, and its cause, Philby's betrayal, was only confirmed years later. The CIA's James Angleton, who had been Philby's closest American intelligence contact during Philby's Washington liaison posting, spent years after Philby's exposure in a state of counterintelligence paranoia that itself became damaging. Angleton concluded that the CIA had been penetrated at the highest level and conducted a mole hunt that wrongly suspected multiple legitimate CIA officers, destroyed careers, and paralyzed the agency's Soviet operations for years. The damage Philby caused to American intelligence was not limited to what he passed to Moscow. It extended to what his exposure caused Angleton to do to the CIA itself. Penetration produces damage in multiple directions simultaneously. Burgess and Maclean defected to Moscow in May 1951, warned by Philby, who had learned from the CIA's Angleton that Maclean was about to be interrogated. Their flight was chaotic, partially improvised, and left behind a trail of evidence that should have exposed Philby immediately. The 3 men had been friends at Cambridge. Burgess had been living in Philby's Washington house when he fled. The connection was visible. MI6 investigated Philby and found, or concluded they had found, insufficient evidence. The specific reason the investigators could not bring themselves to believe it. Philby was one of them. The class assumption protected him again for 12 more years. Philby's 1955 press conference, called after he was named in Parliament as a suspected Soviet agent, is one of the most extraordinary performances in Cold War history. He denied everything. He was smooth, confident, and believable. The British press largely accepted his denial. MI6 accepted it sufficiently to continue using him as an agent in Beirut from 1956. He continued passing intelligence to Moscow until his defection in January 1963. The specific absurdity: MI6 employed a known suspected Soviet agent as an active field officer for 8 years after he had been publicly named. The class assumption did not merely protect him during the inquiry. It kept him employed afterward. Philby's 1955 press conference, called after he was named in Parliament as a suspected Soviet agent, is one of the most extraordinary performances in Cold War history. He denied everything. He was smooth, confident, and believable. The British press largely accepted his denial. MI6 accepted it sufficiently to continue using him as an agent in Beirut from 1956. He continued passing intelligence to Moscow until his defection in January 1963. The specific absurdity: MI6 employed a known suspected Soviet agent as an active field officer for 8 years after he had been publicly named. The class assumption did not merely protect him during the inquiry. It kept him employed afterward. Anthony Blunt's exposure was handled in a way that reveals the British establishment's specific priorities more clearly than any other element of the Cambridge Five story. Blunt, surveyor of the Queen's pictures, a knight, a distinguished art historian, was privately confronted by me in 1964 and offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full confession and cooperation. He accepted. He remained in his royal appointment. He was not publicly exposed until 1979, when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher named him in Parliament. He had been publicly knighted, received publicly, living publicly as a distinguished member of the establishment for 15 years after his private confession. The immunity arrangement protected the institution as much as the man. The Cambridge Five's legacy in Western intelligence is specific and enduring. MI6 was subjected to comprehensive internal review and institutional reform in the 1960s and 1970s. The CIA's relationship with British intelligence was fundamentally damaged. Certain intelligence categories were not shared with MI6 for years after Philby's defection, and the restoration of full sharing required decades of trust rebuilding. The specific concept of positive vetting background investigation of intelligence personnel, rather than reliance on class and character references, was introduced into British intelligence directly as a consequence of the Cambridge Five. Before the Five, a gentleman's character was vouched for by other gentlemen. After the Five, it was investigated. The deeper legacy is cultural and psychological. The Cambridge Five demonstrated that ideological commitment, genuine belief in a cause, is the most dangerous recruitment motivator, because it does not require coercion or payment, and because it persists through the specific hardships that coerced or paid agents eventually cannot sustain. All five maintained their commitment for decades. None was primarily motivated by money. The Soviet intelligence service understood this before Western counterintelligence did. The specific insight that ideologically committed sources are more reliable, more resilient, and more penetrating than any other category remains the foundation of every sophisticated intelligence recruitment program operating in 2026. The Cambridge Five story raises a specific moral question that is more uncomfortable than the straightforward espionage narrative. Were they traitors or idealists? The answer, honestly rendered, is both simultaneously. They genuinely believed, at least initially, that the Soviet Union represented a better future than the capitalism and fascism they saw destroying their world in the 1930s. They maintained that belief through evidence of Soviet atrocities that should have tested it. Some of them, Philby most clearly, maintained the commitment past any point where idealism could have sustained it, suggesting something closer to institutional loyalty to the KGB itself than to the original ideology. The journey from idealism to institutional loyalty is the most psychologically complex element of the Cambridge Five's individual stories. The class dimension of the Cambridge Five is the element that most specifically challenges the British national narrative. The most damaging intelligence failure in British history was not a penetration from outside. It was a self-inflicted wound by the products of the country's most prestigious institutions. Men who had been given every advantage the British establishment could provide, and who used those advantages to serve its adversary. The specific irony, the class assumption that protected them, The establishment's unwillingness to believe that men of their education could be traitors was the direct consequence of the same class system that produced their original radicalization. The system that created the problem also prevented its detection. The Cambridge Five's enduring significance is the specific combination of lessons they produced. That ideological commitment is the most powerful recruitment motivator, that institutional class assumptions are the most effective operational cover, that penetration at the highest level produces damage that cannot be fully audited, and that the response to penetration, the paranoid mole hunt, can damage an institution as severely as the penetration itself. Each of these lessons was hard-won in real operations with real agents who did not survive their compromise and real damage to Anglo-American intelligence that took decades to repair. The lessons are in every intelligence training curriculum. The conditions that produce them have not been fully eliminated. The Cambridge Five's enduring significance is the specific combination of lessons they produced, that ideological commitment is the most powerful recruitment motivator, that institutional class assumptions are the most effective operational cover, that penetration at the highest level produces damage that cannot be fully audited, and that the response to penetration, the paranoid mole hunt, can damage an institution as severely as the penetration itself. Each of these lessons was hard-won in real operations with real agents who did not survive their compromise and real damage to Anglo-American intelligence that took decades to repair. The lessons are in every intelligence training curriculum. The conditions that produce them have not been fully eliminated.